The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of attorneys and defendants, the usual hum of daily proceedings. Judge Henry Harris sat at the bench, his face a mask of authority as he scanned through the case files in front of him. The career built on strict adherence to the law, he was known for his no-nonsense attitude and his tendency to make swift decisions. To him, justice was black and white. There was no room for gray areas. Simone Williams stood in the defendant's chair, her posture straight, but her expression calm. Her dark eyes were fixed ahead, unblinking. She had been through worse, many worse situations, but she never let it show. Today, it was a minor traffic violation, a mistake made on a busy morning, a lapse in judgment. She had expected the fine. In fact, she was prepared for it. It wasn't the penalty that mattered to her. It was the principle of it all. She had come to know this system all too well. Ms. Williams. Judge Harris's voice cut through the room like a knife, sharp and commanding. You've been found guilty of failure to yield. This is a serious offense. I'm imposing a fine of $500. You'll have 30 days to pay. Simone nodded silently. She had heard worse from the system. $500 was a number she could manage, though it wasn't easy. What bothered her more was the brief glance he gave her as he passed judgment. Quick, almost dismissive, as if she were just another name in a stack of files to be processed. She had seen it before. The automatic assumptions based on appearance, on background, on a lifetime of invisible labels placed on her by others. But today, she wouldn't let it rattle her. Court dismissed, Judge Harris declared, and the room shifted into movement, papers rustling, people gathering their things. Simone turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her step steady and composed. She had no intention of making waves. Not here. Not today. But as she reached the door, a thought lingered at the back of her mind. She wondered if Judge Harris even realized who he had just fined, if he knew that she wasn't just any defendant. She was a woman with a mission, a woman who had spent years fighting for justice where it didn't always exist. She wasn't someone who could be dismissed easily. Outside, the air was crisp and the world felt quieter than usual. Simone took a deep breath. She'd be fine. It wasn't the first time the system had turned its back on her, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But the look on the judge's face, that quick judgment, the kind of judgment that didn't care to know her full story, it would stay with her. And she would make sure it stayed with him too. For now, though, she had other things to focus on. Justice was waiting, and she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all a judge, distract her from the larger fight ahead. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind for Simone Williams. Her name continued to appear in the news, but for reasons far beyond a simple traffic fine. Her latest project, a nationwide initiative to reform sentencing laws and reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system, had started to gain significant traction. She had been interviewed on national television, quoted in major newspapers, and invited to speak at high-profile conferences. Simone wasn't just an advocate anymore. She was becoming the voice of a new wave of justice reform. Simone had always worked in the background, fighting tirelessly for change. But now, it seemed as if the spotlight was beginning to find her. And while she had never been someone who sought fame, she understood the power that visibility could bring to her cause. The more people saw her, the more they heard her message. But even with all the attention, she didn't forget where she came from. She continued to meet with those on the front lines, ex-offenders, activists, and those who had lived the injustices she now fought against. Meanwhile, Judge Henry Harris had been unaware of just how much Simone's influence had spread. His routine had remained unshaken by the headlines. The fine he had imposed on her, nothing more than a footnote in his day, was already fading from his memory. To him, it was just another case in a long list of cases he had presided over. Yet, as Simone's name began to appear more frequently in his newsfeed, his curiosity was piqued. One morning, over a cup of coffee at his kitchen table, Harris came across another article about her. This time, it wasn't just a headline. Simone was being recognized as the keynote speaker at a major national summit on criminal justice reform. The article highlighted her work, detailing how she had successfully lobbied for new policies aimed at reducing the disproportionate impact of the justice system on communities of color. She was helping to reshape the national conversation, and in doing so, she was becoming an influential figure not just locally, but on a global scale. Judge Harris couldn't help but stare at the screen. He was surprised, no, startled, to see the name of the woman he had fined just a few weeks ago. It didn't make sense to him. How could someone like Simone, who had seemed so ordinary in court, be leading a movement of such magnitude? Harris had been so quick to pass judgment, to impose a fine on her without ever questioning her background, her story, or her role in the wider picture. It was unsettling to him, the idea that he could have been so wrong about someone. He closed his laptop, a sense of unease settling in. Was it possible that he had underestimated her? And more importantly, had he misjudged her based on nothing more than an assumption? He didn't know the answers yet, but something told him that he needed to understand more about Simone Williams. It was time to look beyond the courtroom and uncover the woman behind the name. The more Judge Harris dug into Simone Williams' background, the more he realized how little he truly knew. The name he had dismissed so quickly in court was tied to a much larger narrative, a narrative of resilience, activism, and a deep-rooted commitment to justice. It wasn't long before he found himself reading articles, interviews, and speeches she had delivered at various events. Every page he turned revealed a layer of Simone that had been hidden beneath the surface, a woman whose life had been marked by struggle and triumph in ways Harris had never imagined. Simone had grown up in a neighborhood that was often ignored by the very systems that were supposed to protect its residents. Her family had faced financial hardships, and she had witnessed the devastating effects of an unfair justice system firsthand. She had lost family members to the prison system, victims of the very policies she was now fighting to dismantle. It wasn't just academic theory to her, it was personal. Every reform she championed, every initiative she pushed forward, was born from her own experiences and the pain she had seen within her community. Harris was struck by her story. She had been determined to succeed in a world that had never made space for her, and her rise in the legal field was a testament to her grit. As a young lawyer, Simone had worked long hours in public defense, representing clients who had been marginalized by society. She'd fought battles that many others had given up on, all while maintaining a sense of compassion and belief that change was possible. But it was when she took on systemic reform that she truly made her mark. She had become a national leader, advocating for policies aimed at eliminating racial bias in the courts and reducing mass incarceration. She was the voice of those who had long been silenced. Judge Harris found himself increasingly impressed, but also uncomfortable. He had based his judgment on the assumption that Simone was just another defendant in a long line of minor cases. He had never stopped to ask why she was there or what brought her to his courtroom. In fact, he had never even considered how the justice system itself might have been a part of her story long before she stood before him that day. His decision had been swift, almost automatic, and in that speed, he had overlooked the greater significance of the woman he had fined. His thoughts swirled. He had spent his career believing that his job was to uphold the law impartially, without bias or favor. But as he read more about Simone's work and the life she had lived, he realized how little he had understood about the people who came before him. He had never questioned the fairness of the system, until now. Simone's journey was a revelation, a window into a world he had never fully seen, and he could feel his own perspective shifting. What had seemed like a routine case was now a wake-up call. He knew he couldn't just move on from this, not without confronting what he had learned. Something had to change. But what? And how? The questions lingered in his mind, unanswered, as he sat back in his chair, grappling with a growing sense of unease. Judge Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted inside him. It wasn't just the fact that Simone Williams had become a national figure in criminal justice reform. It was the realization that he had made a snap judgment, one that may have been rooted in biases he hadn't even acknowledged before. The unease gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on his fairness. But now, in the quiet moments when he wasn't distracted by case files and court procedures, the weight of his past decisions began to settle on his conscience. The fine he had imposed on Simone felt different now. It wasn't just a fine anymore. It was a symbol of something deeper. He had treated her as though she was just another defendant, another person who had made a mistake and was to be punished. But what he hadn't realized at the time was that Simone's life, her work, and her mission had been so much bigger than that moment in his courtroom. She wasn't someone to be dismissed, yet in his mind, that's exactly what he had done. It wasn't the first time, and he feared it wouldn't be the last, if he didn't change how he viewed the cases that came before him. Judge Harris spent the next few days reflecting, questioning his decisions, his perceptions, and the very system he had been a part of for so long. He began to dig into more articles, more interviews with activists and reformers. He listened to podcasts, read books on systemic inequality in the justice system, and even attended a few community forums on racial justice. The more he learned, the more the reality of his own shortcomings became apparent. He had been trained to see the law as an objective set of rules, but he now understood that it was shaped by human interpretation, by personal biases, and by historical patterns that were difficult to ignore. One evening, as he sat at his desk staring at his computer, Harris stumbled upon a video from a recent panel discussion Simone had been part of. It was a powerful conversation about racial disparity in sentencing, and Simone's words stood out. "Justice is not blind," she had said. "It is shaped by those who enforce it." The words echoed in his mind long after the video ended. He thought about his own actions, his automatic assumption that the law would always be just, that the people standing before him in court were there because they deserved to be. He had believed the system was infallible, not seeing that its flaws were often hidden in plain sight. The more Harris thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood about the people he judged. Simone Williams had brought that truth to the surface. He had failed to see her for who she truly was: an advocate, a change-maker, a leader, and instead had treated her like any other defendant. It was a realization that both humbled and humbled him. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could change his approach moving forward. A decision was forming in his mind. There was more to justice than the courtroom. It was time to learn more, to challenge his assumptions, and to make sure he didn't let another person like Simone pass through his courtroom without understanding their story. Months passed, and Judge Harris continued to wrestle with the questions that had been planted in his mind. He attended seminars, read more about criminal justice reform, and even spoke to colleagues who had long been advocates for change. But despite his efforts to understand, one question remained: how could he personally contribute to this evolution of justice? His role as a judge, one defined by order and precedent, felt distant from the activism that Simone Williams embodied. Still, he was determined to learn and, if possible, make a difference. Then came an invitation that would change the course of his journey. He received an email one morning informing him that he had been selected to sit on a panel at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The event was to be held in a few weeks, and the keynote speaker was none other than Simone Williams herself. The organizers had paired Harris with several well-known reform advocates, but he still felt out of place. He had never considered himself an advocate for anything other than the law itself. To him, this was a professional duty, one in which he could passively contribute. But it was Simone's name on the schedule that caught his attention. It wasn't long before Harris found himself standing in the conference hall, scanning the crowd. The energy in the room was different from anything he had experienced in his long career in the court system. There were passionate conversations happening everywhere, conversations about breaking down walls, changing the course of history, and tackling the very foundation of injustice. He realized then just how far removed he had been from the real, lived experiences of those who needed change the most. As he walked toward the panel discussion area, Harris's gaze landed on Simone. She was in the center of a group of activists, speaking with them animatedly. There was a presence about her that was undeniable. She radiated confidence and purpose. But it wasn't just her position as a leader that drew him in. It was the authenticity in the way she spoke to those around her, as though she truly saw each person for who they were. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to introduce himself. What could he say? He hadn't had the courage to apologize when they crossed paths at the courthouse, and now he felt like an outsider in a room full of people who were actively working to change the system he had spent his career upholding. But as the panel session drew closer, Harris knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. Approaching her, he cleared his throat and, with some hesitation, introduced himself. "Ms. Williams, it's an honor to meet you in person," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of regret he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Simone turned to face him. There was no immediate recognition in her eyes, but she offered a warm smile. "Judge Harris," she said, her tone polite yet neutral. "It's nice to meet you too." For a brief moment, they stood in silence. The weight of their shared history, the fine, the courtroom, the uneasy tension, hung between them like a quiet gap. Harris didn't know how to bridge it, but he knew one thing for certain. This meeting wasn't just a coincidence. There was a deeper purpose at work here, and he had to find it. Simone Williams studied Judge Henry Harris as he stood before her. She could tell he wasn't like the other judges she had encountered over the years, those who were so wrapped up in their authority that they never saw the people they impacted. There was something about him that suggested uncertainty, a sense of internal conflict. But it wasn't something she had time to dwell on. There were too many people to talk to, too many conversations to have at this event. Still, there was a subtle pull in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting wasn't random. Harris seemed to sense that she was waiting for him to say something more. He shifted uncomfortably, then finally spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice soft but steady. "When you stood before me in my courtroom, I didn't see you for who you really were. I made an assumption that I shouldn't have made, and I've been reflecting on it ever since." Simone blinked, surprised at his directness. It wasn't every day that a judge, especially one with his level of experience, admitted a mistake so openly. She had been prepared to brush off any potential awkwardness. But now, hearing his admission, she found herself considering what this could mean. She studied him for a moment, her mind racing through the memories of that day in the courtroom. The fine, the quick decision, the assumption that she was just another name in a long list of cases. Simone took a breath, keeping her tone even. "It's not the first time someone's made that assumption about me," she said, her words measured. "But I appreciate you saying that." There was no anger in her voice, just an acknowledgement of the reality she had faced her entire life. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. The hustle and bustle of the conference continued around them. But for Simone and Harris, it felt like the world had quieted, giving them space to process the exchange. Harris wasn't sure what to say next. The apology, while appreciated, didn't feel like it was enough. He had to know more, understand more about Simone, and perhaps, in the process, understand himself. But where to begin? "I've been learning about the reforms you're pushing for," Harris said, his tone more thoughtful now. "I've been trying to understand more about the system, about its flaws. I thought I knew it well, but you've opened my eyes to things I never considered before." Simone's expression softened. "That's the thing, isn't it? We often think we know the system because we've seen it from one side. But it's so much more complicated than that. It's not just about following the rules. It's about seeing people, really seeing them." She paused, her eyes locking with his. The system wasn't built to be just. It was built to maintain power. And while we can't change everything overnight, we can start by acknowledging those flaws. Harris nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. He had been so focused on his role as a judge, so focused on maintaining the structure he was taught to uphold, that he hadn't truly examined the system from a human perspective. In that moment, he realized how much he still had to learn. And maybe, just maybe, He had found the person who could help him start. "I'd like to learn more from you," Harris said quietly. "I want to understand. And if I can, I want to help." Simone met his gaze, searching for sincerity. After a long beat, she gave a small nod. "I think you're ready to listen. Let's talk." It wasn't an agreement to work together, not yet, but it was a start, a shared moment of understanding, one that would eventually lead to much more. The following months saw a quiet transformation in Judge Harris. He had started to attend more community meetings, taking time to listen to the voices he had once dismissed. He participated in conferences, reading books on criminal justice reform, and meeting with local activists. But it was his ongoing discussions with Simone Williams that truly reshaped his understanding. Every conversation with her felt like a step closer to understanding the depth of systemic inequality, and more importantly, how he could be a part of the solution. Simone, for her part, had been open to his questions, guiding him through the layers of the system with patience. But it was clear she wasn't doing it to appease him. She believed that true change could only come when people in positions of power, like Harris, understood the realities those outside the system faced. She had agreed to meet with him regularly, offering insight on the initiatives she had been championing and discussing the ways in which the justice system could evolve. The more they talked, the more they realized how their work, though rooted in different worlds, intertwined. One day, during a meeting in her office, Simone laid out a proposal for a new reform initiative she was working on. It involved a comprehensive review of sentencing guidelines, with the goal of reducing racial disparities in the punishment of minor crimes. The initiative had the potential to shift public opinion, but it would need powerful allies to make it a reality. "You're in a unique position, Judge," Simone said as they sat at a table strewn with policy papers. "You've seen firsthand how the system operates. Your voice carries weight. If you're on board, we could push this forward in a way that actually gets attention." Harris sat back, considering her words. The idea was daunting, but there was no denying the urgency he now felt. For the first time in his career, he saw the true power of his position, not just in passing judgment, but in shaping the kind of justice that truly served everyone, not just those with resources or privilege. "I've spent so much of my career focusing on the rules, on the law itself," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and conviction. "But this is something different. It's about fairness, about understanding the real consequences of the system I've upheld for years." "You're right. I can use my position to make a difference." Simone smiled, the warmth in her eyes reflecting a mix of hope and cautious optimism. "It's not going to be easy," she warned. "There will be resistance. There will be those who don't want to see change. But if we stick together, if we stay focused on the goal, we can shift the system. One case, one policy, one mind at a time." They both knew it wasn't going to be an overnight transformation. There would be long hours, challenging conversations, and countless obstacles. But something had shifted. Harris no longer viewed his work as just following the law. He understood now that his work was about shaping it, making it just, not just legal. And with Simone by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their collaboration was just beginning. Together, they would push for the reforms that had once seemed impossible, using their shared vision to challenge the deep-rooted systems of inequality. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Harris felt truly ready to walk it, not as a judge, but as an advocate for the kind of justice Simone had been fighting for all along. The months that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, speeches, and late-night strategy sessions. Judge Harris and Simone Williams became an unlikely but powerful team, pushing forward with reform initiatives that were gaining momentum across the country. Their combined efforts were reaching people from all walks of life: activists, lawmakers, community leaders, and even the public at large. Their message was clear: the justice system needed to be redefined. It wasn't enough to simply apply the law. It needed to be equitable, compassionate, and most importantly, just. Simone and Harris traveled together, speaking at conferences, addressing lawmakers, and visiting communities most affected by the flaws in the justice system. Harris, once the epitome of the status quo, now found himself advocating for the changes he had once resisted. His speeches were no longer about the technicalities of the law. They were about humanizing justice, about ensuring that the law served everyone, not just those with privilege or resources. Simone had always been the driving force behind their efforts, but Harris's transformation was undeniable. He had gone from the rigid, methodical judge who had fined her months ago to one of the leading voices in the movement for justice reform. And as they worked side by side, someone began to recognize the sincerity in his change. His understanding had deepened, and his commitment to righting the wrongs of the system had become unwavering. Their first major victory came when they helped pass a landmark piece of legislation aimed at reducing racial disparities in sentencing. The bill had been introduced months earlier, but with Harris's newfound influence, it gained traction in ways that had once seemed impossible. It was a small but significant win, a win that reflected the power of their collaboration and the impact of their voices joining together for a common cause. But they both knew this was just the beginning. At a ceremony held to commemorate the new law, Harris and Simone were invited to speak together. The room was filled with supporters, lawmakers, and activists, all gathered to celebrate the hard-fought victory. As they stood together at the podium, Simone turned to Harris with a smile. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet pride. Harris's gaze shifted to the crowd before him, and then to Simone. He had been a part of many ceremonies in his career, but none like this. This wasn't about the formality of the event or the weight of his title. It was about the work they had done, the lives they had touched, and the promise of a better future they had created together. "As a judge, I've always believed that the law is meant to serve justice," Harris began, his voice clear and resolute. "But justice doesn't come just from the letter of the law. It comes from understanding, from empathy, and from the willingness to challenge a system that has failed so many for so long." Simone stood beside him, nodding in agreement. Their partnership had become a symbol of what was possible when people, regardless of their background, came together with a shared vision. It was a testament to the power of growth, of transformation, and of finding common ground. As they left the stage, the applause echoing in their ears, they knew they had made an impact, not just through the policy they had helped change, but through the conversations they had started. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, they felt hopeful. The legacy they had begun building was one of true justice, a justice that was no longer defined by rules, but by the fairness and humanity behind them. In the end, it wasn't just about winning laws. It was about changing lives, including their own. And together, they had begun to do just that.